Marcus Ellison adjusted the cuff of his navy suit as he stepped through the terminal. The polished leather shoes beneath him echoed softly against the floor, matching the calm rhythm of a man who had spent his entire life earning every opportunity instead of expecting one. People hurried past without noticing him. Families searched for their gates. Business travelers stared into laptops. Children pointed excitedly toward the giant aircraft beyond the windows. Marcus simply walked. His phone vibrated. "Good morning, sir," his assistant said. "The transportation team will meet you after landing." "The budget meeting starts at 10. Marcus smiled faintly. "Perfect. Tell everyone I'll be there on time. We're all looking forward to seeing you. I appreciate it." He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. Gray-haired man standing nearby glanced at Marcus's boarding pass as it briefly appeared in his hand before quickly looking away again. Another passenger studied Marcus's tailored suit with quiet curiosity. Neither of them knew who he was. Marcus had grown used to that. The expensive watch on his wrist wasn't the first thing he had earned. Respect should have been. A familiar memory surfaced. His high school guidance counselor had once folded her hands across the desk and quietly said, "Students from neighborhoods like yours usually choose more realistic careers." Marcus remembered answering with the same calm voice he still carried today. "I'll let my work decide what's realistic." Years later, an Ivy League degree hung on his office wall. Years after that, thousands of employees worked under his leadership. Yet memories like that never completely disappeared. They simply became quieter. A boarding announcement interrupted his thoughts. First-class passengers may now begin boarding. Marcus picked up his briefcase and joined the line. A smiling airline. Employees scanned boarding passes one after another. "Good morning. Welcome aboard. Have a wonderful flight." "Samsi." Greetings flowed effortlessly. Marcus waited patiently, never rushing anyone. Behind him, a young businessman looked at Marcus's tailored suit and whispered to his colleague, "He looks like he's headed to an important meeting." His friend nodded. "Probably another executive." Marcus pretended not to hear. Compliments had never erased assumptions. He reached the front of the line and extended his boarding pass with a polite smile. "Good morning." For a brief second, the employee's smile hesitated. Her eyes moved from the boarding pass to Marcus's face, then back again. The silence lasted only a heartbeat, but Marcus had lived long enough to recognize that silence. It was the kind that often arrived just before someone decided who he was without asking a single question. He remained perfectly still, waiting. The employee looked up again. Her expression had already begun to change. The employee's expression had already begun to change. Instead of scanning the boarding pass, she lifted one hand across the entrance with practiced confidence. One moment. "Sir," Marcus stopped without protest. Behind him, the line continued moving. Passengers ahead received cheerful smiles. "Welcome aboard. Enjoy your flight." "Right this way." Each greeting sounded effortless. Marcus waited quietly, his boarding pass still resting in his hand. The flight attendant looked at him again before speaking. "May I see your ticket once more?" He handed it to her without hesitation. "You already have it," he said gently. "I just need another look." She studied the screen longer than necessary. Nothing was wrong. Marcus could see that. Still, she did not step aside. A businessman behind him shifted impatiently. "Is everything okay?" The attendant answered without looking away from Marcus. "It'll just take a second." Marcus recognized the pause immediately. No harsh words, no raised voice, just another invisible test. Years earlier, security guards had followed him through department stores without saying why. Restaurant hosts had questioned reservations already, carrying his name. Hotel clerks had asked twice for identification, while welcoming others with nothing more than a smile. The pattern was always familiar. Courtesy. First, suspicion. Second, he kept his voice calm. "Is there a problem with my boarding pass?" She forced a polite smile. "I'm simply verifying something." "What exactly?" Another brief silence. She didn't answer. Instead, she glanced toward a nearby coworker, who looked confused, but walked over anyway. Marcus noticed nearby passengers beginning to watch. Some quickly looked away. Others pretended to check their phones. Nobody spoke. Nobody asked why every other first-class passenger had boarded without interruption. The coworker stopped beside her. "Everything all right?" She lowered her voice. I just want to make sure before letting him through. Marcus slowly lowered his hand. I'm sorry, she'd said. The service entrance is around the back, Marcus had answered. Softly, I'm here for the academic interview, her smile. Disappeared. Oh, another memory followed after graduating with honors from college. He had entered a corporate office for his first executive interview. The receptionist had asked, Are you here to deliver the catering? When he explained he was the candidate for vice president, the room had fallen into awkward silence. The questions always changed. The message never did. Are you sure you belong here? The aircraft aisle suddenly felt much longer than before. He reached an empty economy seat and placed his briefcase beneath it. Across the aisle, an elderly woman looked at him with kind eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. Marcus offered a gentle smile. You didn't do this? No, she replied quietly, but I watched it happen. Marcus nodded. So did everyone else. Neither of them spoke again. Outside the window, baggage crews prepared the aircraft for departure. Inside, Marcus sat in silence, realizing the hardest part was never losing a better seat. It was watching the same invisible barrier follow him through every stage of a life he had spent proving he belonged. It was watching the same invisible barrier follow him through every stage of a life he had spent proving he belonged. Marcus rested against the seat and closed his eyes. The aircraft around him slowly disappeared. He was 10 years old again, standing beside a cardboard model rocket. At his elementary school science fair, his teacher smiled kindly. You've done excellent work, Marcus grinned. Want to build real spacecraft one day? The teacher hesitated before answering. That's a wonderful dream. Then her voice softened. But people like you usually choose something more practical. Marcus remembered looking down at his project. Why? She sighed. I just don't want you to be disappointed. Years later, a neighbor leaned against a fence while Marcus packed for college. Ivy League schools are hard enough, the man said. Maybe a local college would be more realistic. My grades earned this opportunity, Marcus answered. The neighbor smiled politely. I'm only trying to help. Even after graduation, the warnings continued. A senior executive once studied Marcus during a networking event. You speak well, he said. Thank you. You'll go far if you don't aim too high too quickly, Marcus had asked quietly. How high is too high? The executive laughed. You'll know when you get there. He never explained. He didn't have to. Every conversation carried the same invisible boundary. Different voices, different places. The same message. Dream. Carefully, climb slowly. Know where people expect you to stop. The memory faded as the aircraft cabin returned across the aisle. The elderly woman still watched him with quiet sympathy. Marcus stared at the boarding pass resting in his hand. The paper had never been the real issue. Neither had the seat. Long before airports, boardrooms, or first-class cabins, people had tried to shrink his future with polite smiles and reasonable advice. Yet every ceiling they imagined had eventually become another floor beneath his feet. He folded the boarding pass carefully. No matter how many times the question returned, his answer had never changed. He already belonged before. Anyone else decided whether they believed it. He already belonged before anyone else decided whether they believed it. The aircraft hummed softly as Marcus looked through the window, but another chapter of his life quietly unfolded inside his mind. His office wall held degrees from one of the nation's most respected universities. Leadership. Awards filled polished shelves. Business magazines had featured his photograph. None of them had stopped the questions. He remembered arriving at a luxury hotel for an hour. International conference. The receptionist smiled. Politely, may I help you? I'm checking in. She glanced behind him. Are you with the delivery company? Marcus calmly handed over his reservation. Her expression immediately changed. Another memory followed. He entered a boardroom carrying financial reports for a merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Junior employees stopped him near the door. The catering staff enters through the other. Hallway, Marcus answered without irritation. I'm leading today's meeting. The young man froze. I'm sorry. Marcus simply nodded and walked inside. Even after years of success, introductions always seemed delayed by assumptions. Titles appeared second. Appearance arrived first. The invisible test never completely disappeared. Across the aircraft cabin, the older passenger still held his phone. quietly recording, Marcus noticed him for a brief moment before looking away. He understood. Something painful. People often believed prejudice only lived inside loud insults or obvious hatred. His experience had taught him otherwise. Sometimes it arrived wearing perfect manners. Sometimes it smiled before doubting you. Sometimes it politely asked for proof that nobody else had been required to provide. The elderly woman beside him finally spoke. "You must have accomplished a great deal." Marcus smiled gently. "I've been fortunate." She shook her head. "No," her voice was steady. "You've been persistent." Marcus looked down at the boarding pass, still resting in his hands. Every degree, every promotion, and every award had opened another door. Yet someone always seemed to be standing behind it, quietly asking the same question before learning his name. He had answered it his entire life. Today would be no different. Today would be no different. Marcus slowly unfolded the boarding pass again, tracing its edge with his thumb as another memory quietly surfaced. His first promotion had made him the youngest regional director in company history. The announcement ended with applause. The questions began the next morning. A senior manager stopped outside his office. "Congratulations." "Thank you," the man smiled politely. "So, how did this happen so fast?" Marcus answered simply. "I met every requirement." The manager nodded. "I'm sure you did." Yet his expression suggested another explanation. Months later, Marcus walked into a leadership meeting. A visiting consultant looked around the room. "We're still waiting for the director." Marcus pulled out the chair at the head of the table. "You aren't waiting anymore." The consultant flushed with embarrassment. "I apologize." Marcus smiled. "Let's begin." The apology ended the conversation. The assumption remained. Promotion after promotion brought larger offices, greater responsibility, and heavier expectations. His white colleagues introduced themselves once. Marcus often introduced himself twice, sometimes 3 times. People asked where he worked, then what he actually did, then whether he truly held the position listed beneath his name. Each question sounded harmless alone. Together, they formed another invisible examination. Across the aisle, the elderly woman noticed his distant expression. "You've been thinking?" Marcus gave a faint smile. "Just remembering." "Bad memories?" He considered the question. "Important ones." She nodded with quiet understanding. "You kept going anyway." "I didn't have another choice." The aircraft remained parked at the gate. Outside, ground crews continued their routine without knowing the delay inside had little to do with aviation. Marcus looked toward the first-class cabin. He realized something. That still saddened him. His promotions had never frightened him. The endless need to justify them had. Some people inherited confidence the moment they received a title. Marcus had been expected to earn that confidence again every time he walked into another room. Today, the room had simply become an airplane. The test, however, was painfully familiar once again. Marcus looked around the aircraft cabin. The leather seats in first class were only a few rows ahead. His name had been printed beside one of them long before he arrived at the airport. Still, suspicion had reached that seat before he ever could. A flight attendant walked past without meeting his eyes. The older passenger quietly lowered his phone but kept recording. Nobody knew where this moment would lead. The elderly woman beside Marcus spoke softly. "Does this ever get easier?" Marcus thought for a moment. "You learn how to carry it, but it shouldn't be yours to carry." "No," he admitted. "It shouldn't." He glanced at the boarding pass again. Money had purchased the ticket. Years of hard work had earned the salary. Countless late nights, difficult decisions, and impossible responsibilities had built the career that allowed him to sit in first class whenever business required it. Yet none of those things had entered the aircraft before he did. Only his appearance had. That had spoken first. Across the cabin, passengers continued whispering. One man shook his head. A young woman quietly wiped away a tear. Another traveler stared out the window, unwilling to witness any more. Marcus understood every reaction. Discomfort was easier than involvement. Silence often felt safer than fairness. He placed the boarding pass inside his jacket pocket. "This was never about the seat," he said quietly. The elderly woman looked at him. "No?" Marcus shook his head. It's about being welcomed before being questioned. She lowered her eyes. I think everyone here knows that. Now, Marcus followed her gaze toward the front of the aircraft. The empty first class seat remained waiting. It had always belonged to him. The real battle had never been purchasing the ticket, had always been convincing complete strangers that he deserved to use what he had already earned outside. The cabin door finally closed. Inside, the silence became heavier than the aircraft itself, and every waiting passenger sensed this flight had already changed far more than one man's journey. Inside, the silence became heavier than the aircraft itself, and every waiting passenger sensed this flight had already changed far more than one man's journey. The aircraft finally reached cruising altitude. Passengers settled into quiet. Conversations. Meal carts rolled slowly through the aisle near the middle of the cabin. The older passenger unlocked his phone again. He replayed the recording from the beginning. Marcus standing calmly. The boarding pass. The hesitation. The words, "Sir, I think you're in the wrong line." The long silence afterward. He watched it once, then twice. His wife leaned toward him. "What are you thinking?" He answered without taking his eyes off the screen. "If this disappears, it'll happen again." She nodded slowly. "So, what will you do?" He took a careful breath. "I'm going to let people see it." His thumb hovered above the screen. There was no dramatic music, no speech, no celebration. Just one quiet decision. He pressed upload. The progress bar moved steadily across the display. 5%, 30%, 70%. Finished. He placed the phone on the tray table. "That's it," he whispered. His wife looked uncertain. "Do you think anyone will care?" "I don't know." He glanced toward Marcus, who remained seated in complete silence. But people deserve the chance to know. The aircraft continued through clear skies, completely unaware that something far more powerful than luggage had just departed with it. The video quietly entered the internet. No television cameras followed it. No reporters announced it. No one inside the cabin received any warning. Within minutes, strangers began watching. Someone shared it. Another person copied the link. Comments slowly appeared beneath the footage. What happened before this? Why wasn't his boarding pass enough? This doesn't look like company policy. The older passenger refreshed the screen once. The views climbed. Faster than he expected. He looked toward Marcus. Again, the businessman still stared peacefully through the window, unaware that millions of strangers would soon witness the calm dignity he had protected while others questioned whether he belonged. One gentle tap had carried the truth far beyond the aircraft. Nothing about the flight would ever remain ordinary again. Nothing about the flight would ever remain ordinary again. The first notification reached the airline's customer relations office. Before the aircraft even landed, a young employee frowned at her monitor. "This video is spreading fast." Her supervisor barely looked up. "It'll slow down. It already has 50,000 views." He finally stood. "Show me." Minutes later, another alert appeared. Then another. Inside a records room on the 5th floor, an elderly compliance officer quietly unlocked a gray filing cabinet that had not been opened in years. She removed one folder, then another. Passenger. Complaint.customerconcern.internal review. Each carried familiar words. Passenger questioned without cause. Unequal treatment. Bias. During boarding, she whispered to herself. We've seen this before. Down the hallway, a retired station manager watched the viral video from his living room. His phone rang. "Frank?" a reporter asked. Did incidents like this ever happen before? Frank remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he answered. "More times than people realize." "Were they reported?" "Yes." "What happened?" He sighed. Most reports disappeared. Inside another home, a former flight attendant stared at the screen. Her daughter asked quietly, "Mom, why are you crying?" "I remember this. You were there?" "No." She looked away. "I watched similar moments happen. And?" I said nothing. Across the country, current employees exchanged private messages. "I've seen this before." "So have I." "Remember the doctor they questioned last year? The attorney in Chicago? The military officer in Atlanta?" No one needed long explanations. Everyone remembered. At headquarters, investigators spread old complaint files across a Conference table. One manager flipped. Through another report, this one is 8 years. Old, another answered. So is this. A third folder landed beside them. And here's another. The room became painfully quiet, different cities, different crews, the same. Complaint. Passengers forced to prove they belonged. Extra. Questions? Unnecessary delays? Perfectly. Valid tickets treated with suspicion. The airline's legal director slowly removed his glasses. This isn't one incident. Nobody disagreed. Hours passed as archived recommendations resurfaced. Mandatory training proposals, policy revisions, employee concerns. Every document had been acknowledged. Very few had been implemented. The chief operating officer leaned back heavily. We kept calling them isolated cases. A compliance officer looked directly at him. They weren't isolated. They were connected. Outside the conference room, employees whispered instead of laughing. Inside, confidence quietly disappeared. The viral flight had not created the crisis. It had uncovered it. For years, assumptions had been defended as routine judgment. Complaints had been categorized, filed, and forgotten. Now, every forgotten report had returned, like a witness refusing to remain silent. The executives stopped searching for a statement that could calm the public. They finally faced the truth none of the documents had ever stopped repeating. The greatest threat to the airline was never one video. It was every warning the company had quietly chosen not to hear until the entire world was watching. Before anyone answered another question, the conference room fell into an uneasy silence. The large screen displayed the viral video once again. No one spoke while Marcus calmly handed over his boarding pass. The chief communications officer paused the recording. Our response has to be immediate. The legal director nodded. We apologize, announce an internal review, and move forward. Another executive folded his arms. This is becoming a public relations disaster. The room responded with quiet agreement. No one questioned the assumption behind the incident. They only discussed the damage it had created. The video resumed. Marcus accepted every insult without raising his voice. The chief operating officer frowned. He stayed remarkably calm. That's working against us, someone replied. People sympathize with him. A marketing executive pointed toward the screen. Find out who this passenger is, an assistant answered confidently. We're already trying. Good. The chairman leaned forward. We've survived worse headlines. Several people nodded. They believed experience would solve another crisis. Prepared statements, media interviews, corporate apologies. The familiar routine had protected the company before. No one imagined this situation was different. The assistant quietly entered the room carrying a folder. We've identified the flight crew. Good, the chairman replied. We'll begin interviews immediately. And the passenger? Still confirming his identity. The chairman waved dismissively. It doesn't matter who he is. The assistant hesitated. I think it does. No one noticed the uncertainty in her voice. Their attention remained fixed on the screen, studying camera angles instead of consequences. They searched for communication mistakes. They counted negative comments. They estimated financial exposure, yet they overlooked the one fact that mattered most. The quiet man sitting beside the airplane window possessed influence none of them had even considered. For a few more minutes, confidence remained comfortably alive inside the boardroom. Reality had already started walking toward the door. No one there recognized its face. Before anyone there recognized the face on the screen, the discussion shifted in a completely different direction. The legal director opened a thick binder. We're looking at potential lawsuits. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses. Estimate the exposure. Too early, the attorney replied. But if this continues, the settlement could be significant. Another lawyer placed several charts across the conference table. Social media engagement has doubled in the last hour. News coverage. Every major network is requesting a statement. The communications officer spoke quickly. We'll prepare one immediately. It needs to sound sincere. It also needs to limit liability, the lead attorney interrupted. Heads nodded around the table. Someone suggested offering travel vouchers. Another proposed suspending the crew pending investigation. A third recommended emphasizing company values. Every sentence sounded polished. Every strategy sounded familiar, yet something important remained missing. The assistant quietly looked around the room. Has anyone asked what actually happened to him? Several executives glanced toward her. The chairman answered first. Our priority is protecting the company. She hesitated. What if protecting the company starts with protecting people? No one replied. The silence lasted only a moment before another attorney continued. If we admit discrimination too early, we'll increase legal risk. So we acknowledge concerns, the communications officer said, without accepting responsibility. The legal team immediately agreed. Pages turned, pens moved, projected losses filled the screen. Marketing forecasts replaced uncomfortable questions. The man at the center of the video slowly disappeared beneath spreadsheets, legal language, and carefully rehearsed statements. His dignity had become another item on an agenda. The assistant lowered her notebook. She realized everyone in the room was measuring headlines, contracts, and financial exposure. Almost nobody was measuring the cost of the assumption that had started everything. Outside the boardroom, the public kept asking one simple question. Inside, the company kept avoiding it. Neither side realized that the answer was already walking toward the conference room, carrying a name powerful enough to change the entire conversation forever. Before anyone could answer, another notification appeared on the assistant's laptop. She stared at the screen, then at the paused video. Her breathing slowed. I know who he is. The chairman barely looked up. Then tell us. She swallowed. The passenger's name is Marcus Ellison. No one reacted. The chief financial officer frowned. Should that mean something? The assistant turned the laptop toward them. It should. She opened another page. A biography appeared. Photographs, interviews, corporate announcements. The legal director leaned forward. Wait. His voice became quieter. Marcus Ellison, CEO of Ellison Technologies? She nodded. The same company. Silence settled over the room. The communications officer looked back at the frozen image on the screen. That's him? Yes. The chairman slowly stood. No. The assistant clicked once more. Another document filled the display. Our largest technology partner. The chief operating officer felt his stomach tighten. This can't be right. I'm afraid it is, one executive whispered, almost to himself. We removed our own partner from first class. Nobody corrected him. Nobody even moved. The legal director hurriedly searched through another file. Ellison Technologies. His voice stopped. The chairman looked directly at him. Finish the sentence. They oversee the modernization contract. The one we've been renewing? Yes. Another executive leaned back in disbelief. I thought he was just another business traveler. The assistant answered quietly. So did the crew. Every prepared statement lying on the conference table suddenly looked useless. Every media strategy felt painfully outdated. The chairman slowly lowered himself into his chair. Minutes earlier, they had been discussing a passenger. Now, they were facing someone whose influence reached boardrooms, investors, regulators, and business partners across the country. No one mentioned public relations anymore. No one talked about social media. The room had forgotten every sentence it planned to deliver. The only sound came from the paused video still showing Marcus standing calmly with his boarding pass. For the first time that day, the executives understood the incident had never been small. They had simply failed to recognize the man standing quietly in front of them until it was far too late. They had simply failed to recognize the man standing quietly in front of them until it was far too late. No one spoke. The chairman finally broke the silence. Bring me the Ellison contract. The assistant hurried to a cabinet and returned with a thick blue folder. She placed it gently in the center of the table. The title was impossible to ignore. Ellison Technologies Strategic Partnership. The chief financial officer slowly opened it. His face lost its color. Our modernization agreement, he turned another page, is worth $120 million. The number settled over the room like a weight. No one reached for a pen. No one checked a phone. The chairman stared at the contract without touching it. Hours earlier, it had represented stability. Now it looked like the company's greatest weakness. The legal director cleared his throat. If Mr. Ellison withdraws. He stopped speaking. The chief operating officer finished the sentence. We lose far more than money. Another executive leaned forward. Our competitors will notice immediately. So will investors, someone added. The assistant quietly slid another document beside the contract. His company also advises 3 other transportation firms. Every new page made the room quieter. The communications officer whispered, This is bigger than one airline. The chairman nodded slowly. It always was. No one mentioned the flight attendant. No one blamed the passenger. For the first time, everyone understood that the balance of power had shifted without an argument, without threats, and without Marcus raising his voice once. The contract remained exactly where it had been placed, untouched. Its value had not changed. Their understanding of it had. The chairman finally looked around the table. We spent the entire morning asking how to protect this company. He paused. We should have been asking how we allowed this to happen in the first place. No one answered. The folder remained open between them, silently reminding every executive that the man they had publicly questioned also held the future of one of their most important partnerships quietly in his hands. The folder remained open between them, silently reminding every executive that the man they had publicly questioned also held the future of one of their most important partnerships quietly in his hands. The first phone rang, then another. Within seconds, every corner of the boardroom echoed with vibrating devices and urgent notifications. No one rushed to answer. The confidence that had filled the room an hour earlier quietly disappeared. The chairman finally picked up his phone. Yes, he listened without speaking. When the call ended, he looked older than before. Our largest investor wants an emergency meeting. Another executive answered his own phone. The Transportation Committee is requesting a statement. The communications officer checked her screen. 3 national networks are waiting outside. The legal director closed the contract folder. It won't matter what we say if Mr. Ellison responds first. Nobody challenged him. For the first time all morning, nobody believed polished language could solve the problem. Whispers replaced confident instructions. What if he cancels the contract? What if other partners follow? What if regulators begin asking questions? Every possibility sounded worse than the one before. The assistant quietly watched the room transform. Earlier, these same leaders had spoken with certainty. Now every sentence ended with doubt. The chairman rubbed his forehead. We kept calling this a misunderstanding. The chief operating officer answered softly. It stopped being a misunderstanding the moment we ignored the evidence. No one defended the company anymore. No one searched for another excuse. Outside the conference room, reporters gathered behind security barriers. Inside, executives realized the real crisis had not been created by one viral video. It had been built over years of overlooked complaints, dismissed warnings, and comfortable assumptions. The phones continued ringing. This time, nobody wanted to answer them. Each call carried another reminder that the consequences were no longer waiting outside the building. They had already entered the room. The chairman slowly stood and looked around the table. We can no longer hide this. No one disagreed. For the first time since the video appeared online, every executive understood the same painful truth. The company was no longer fighting a public relations disaster. It was facing the full cost of its own silence. The company was no longer fighting a public relations disaster. It was facing the full cost of its own silence. The chairman had barely returned to his seat when the reception desk called the boardroom. Sir, you're receiving nonstop calls. From who? Everyone. He pressed the speaker button. Start with the first. Atlas Financial. The chairman answered immediately. A familiar voice spoke without greeting. We've worked together for 12 years. I know. Can we still trust your leadership? The line went quiet. The chairman searched for an answer. We're conducting an investigation, the executive interrupted. I didn't ask about the investigation. He paused. I asked about your judgment. The call ended. Another line began ringing. This time it was a government transportation official. We're requesting a formal briefing. When? Within the hour. Before anyone could respond, another assistant entered hurriedly. 3 corporate partners are waiting. Put them through. One call followed another. A logistics company, an international consulting firm, a technology supplier. Nobody asked how many views the video had received. Nobody wanted another media update. Every conversation centered on the same concern. If this happened to your largest partner, what happens to everyone else? The communications officer quietly closed her presentation. None of the prepared talking points addressed that question. Across the table, the legal director whispered, We've lost control of the narrative. The chairman shook his head. No. His voice sounded heavier than before. We've lost something much more valuable. Outside the headquarters, reporters continued gathering. Inside, the phones refused to stop ringing. The assistant looked at the growing list of missed calls. Industry leaders, airport authorities, federal officials. She lowered the tablet. They're not asking what happened anymore. The chairman looked toward the unopened contract folder. I know. They're deciding whether they still believe us. No one argued. No one offered another strategy. The airline had spent years building partnerships through promises of professionalism and trust. Now those same promises were being measured against one quiet passenger, one boarding pass, and one decision that had spread farther than anyone inside the company had ever imagined. The airline had spent years building partnerships through promises of professionalism and trust. Now those same promises were being measured against one quiet passenger, one boarding pass, and one decision that had spread farther than anyone inside the company had ever imagined. Across the financial district, trading floors remained busy, but conversations sounded different. Television screens no longer displayed earnings reports. Every channel carried the same headline. Analysts watched the coverage with growing concern. One investment manager closed a spreadsheet. "Forget this quarter's profits." His colleague looked up. "What matters now?" "Trust." Another analyst refreshed the airline's stock performance. "The price is slipping." "It's not the stock I'm worried about." "What then?" "The confidence behind it." Inside a major investment firm, senior partners gathered around a conference table. One director folded the morning newspaper. "If customers stop believing the company, numbers won't save it." Another executive nodded. "We've recovered from losses before?" "But reputation?" He slowly shook his head. "That's much harder." Across town, a pension fund manager joined a conference call. "Should we reduce our position?" A financial advisor answered carefully. "Not yet." "What are we waiting for?" The company's response. Someone quietly added, "And Mr. Ellison's." The room fell silent. His name now carried as much weight as the airline's financial statements. Back at headquarters, the chief financial officer received another market update. "Our shares are still falling." The chairman remained calm. "They'll recover." The chief financial officer looked directly at him. "The market isn't reacting to today's losses. Then what's driving it?" "Doubt." He placed the report on the table. "Investors can survive weak earnings." He paused before continuing. "They struggle to survive broken confidence." No one challenged the observation. For years, the airline had measured success through revenue, expansion, and quarterly performance. Now, every investor was measuring something impossible to calculate with charts alone: public trust. And everyone inside the boardroom finally understood that once people questioned a company's character, rebuilding belief demanded far more than repairing its balance sheet. That realization frightened them far more than any number appearing on the market screens. Before anyone mentioned resignations publicly, the atmosphere inside the airline had already begun to change. Morning greetings became shorter. Conference rooms stayed occupied longer than usual. Employees who normally laughed together now lowered their voices whenever someone walked past. Near the operations center, 2 supervisors stood beside the coffee machine. "Have you heard anything?" "Only rumors." "About the chairman?" The other supervisor glanced around before answering. "They say the board isn't happy." A baggage operations manager joined them. "I heard 3 executives were called into a private meeting." "No confirmation?" He shook his head. "None." Across the terminal, gate agents quietly exchanged worried looks. One young employee whispered, "Do you think they'll replace senior leadership?" Her coworker sighed. "I think something has to change." Another replied carefully, "It should have happened years ago." No one argued. Inside headquarters, elevators opened and closed as directors hurried between meetings without acknowledging familiar faces. Assistants noticed the difference immediately. Nobody's smiling today. They're trying not to panic. Emails marked "Confidential" appeared in inboxes across multiple departments. Human resources requested updated organizational charts. Security managers received unusual instructions to prepare executive offices for possible transitions. No official announcement had been released. None was necessary. The building itself seemed to understand that something significant was approaching. A maintenance technician quietly folded the newspaper, carrying Marcus Ellison's photograph. "I've worked here 22 years. His colleague looked at him. "Have you ever seen leadership this nervous?" He slowly shook his head. Never. By afternoon, the whispers had reached airport terminals. Across the country, pilots heard them in briefing rooms. Cabin. Crews discussed them between flights. Ground staff exchanged quiet observations while loading baggage. The question was no longer whether changes were coming. It was who would still have an office when they arrived. For the first time in years, positions once considered untouchable suddenly felt uncertain. See, approaching storm had not yet arrived, but everyone inside the airline could already feel the pressure changing. The approaching storm had not yet arrived, but everyone inside the airline could already feel the pressure changing. Late that afternoon, the airline's CEO entered the executive conference room without an escort. Nobody greeted him. Nobody expected a speech. He quietly took his seat and looked around the table. Stacks of reports waited before him. Media summaries, legal assessments, financial Forecasts. He opened the first folder, read 2 pages, closed it again. The chairman finally asked, "Would you like an update?" The CEO nodded once. "Go ahead." For 20 minutes, department heads explained falling confidence, investor concerns, government inquiries, and growing public criticism. He interrupted no one. When the final presentation ended, silence settled over the room. Everyone waited. The communications officer leaned forward. "We should hold another press conference." The CEO looked at her calmly. "No." The legal director suggested another public statement. He received the same answer. "No." The chief operating officer spoke carefully. "Then what do we do?" The CEO folded his hands. "We listen." Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. The chairman frowned. People expect leadership. They do. And they expect action. They do. Then why stay silent? The CEO looked toward the paused image of Marcus Ellison displayed on the screen. Because empty promises sound louder than honest responsibility. Nobody answered. He slowly stood and walked to the window, overlooking the headquarters entrance. Reporters filled the sidewalk. Below, camera crews waited patiently. The CEO spoke. Without turning around, "We cannot repair trust by talking faster." He paused. "We repair it by changing faster." The room remained completely still. For the first time that day, no executive offered another presentation, another slogan, or another carefully rehearsed explanation. The CEO signed 2 internal documents and handed them to his assistant. She glanced at the pages, then looked up in surprise. He simply nodded. His quiet decisions carried more weight than any speech the company could have delivered. Everyone understood the same painful truth. Time was no longer working for the airline, was quietly working against it. And every passing hour made rebuilding public confidence even more difficult. Before anyone left the conference room, every conversation returned to the same name: Marcus Ellison. No one discussed his title anymore. No one questioned his credentials. The only question remaining was painfully simple. What would he do next? Across the city, Marcus sat inside his office, overlooking the skyline. The television remained muted. News anchors continued repeating the story. His assistant entered quietly. "The airline has called 6 times. Marcus looked up from the contract resting on his desk. "I know. They're requesting a meeting." He closed the folder without answering. A senior vice president stepped inside. "The partnership renewal. Documents are ready." Marcus nodded. "Leave them here." The room became silent again. No anger crossed his face. No satisfaction appeared in his expression. He simply studied the signature page waiting before him. 1 line. 1 signature. 1 decision. His assistant finally spoke. "Everyone is waiting." Marcus looked toward the window. "They're waiting for the wrong thing." She frowned slightly. "They think this is about revenge. It isn't. What is it about?" He answered calmly. "It's about accountability." The vice president sat across from him. "If you suspend the agreement, the entire industry will notice." Marcus nodded once. "They should." His assistant hesitated. "Will you sign today?" Marcus rested his hand beside the document but never touched the pen. "Not until I know whether they've learned anything." Outside his office, financial markets waited. Corporate partners watched. Government officials monitored every development. Inside airline headquarters, executives refreshed their phones every few minutes, hoping for any update. No message arrived, no announcement appeared. The silence became heavier than any public statement. Marcus finally reached for the pen. Everyone watching imagined the next movement would determine the future of one airline. They were only partly correct. The signature would affect far more than a single company. It would become a measure of whether patience, dignity, and quiet restraint could accomplish what outrage never could. Marcus uncapped the pen, then he paused once more. Before anyone could guess his decision, Marcus uncapped the pen. The room remained completely silent. His assistant watched without speaking. The vice president folded his hands and waited. Marcus read the final. "Page 1, last time." Then he signed. The ink settled quietly across the document. No applause followed. No celebration, no expression of triumph crossed his face. He handed the agreement back to the vice President, effective immediately. The executive accepted the folder carefully. I'll notify legal. Marcus nodded. Make sure they receive the notice before the media. Does. It will be done. His assistant looked at him. Should we prepare a press conference? Marcus shook his head. No. A public statement? One sentence. She opened her notebook. He spoke calmly. Ellison Technologies is temporarily suspending its $120 million partnership, pending a full independent review of the airline's conduct and corrective actions. She finished writing. That's all. Marcus stood and looked through the office window. That's enough. Within minutes, the official notice reached Airline headquarters. The legal director read it twice. Before passing it across the table, nobody questioned its authenticity. Nobody searched for hidden conditions. The suspension was lawful. Professional? Tout final. The chairman slowly removed his glasses, so it's frozen. The chief financial officer lowered his head, effective immediately. No one blamed Marcus. Even those most affected understood the decision had not been driven by anger. He had offered no insults, made no threats, demanded no revenge. He had simply held the company accountable through the authority it had once taken for granted across the aviation industry. Executives stopped their meetings to read the announcement. Competitors exchanged quiet glances. Business leaders understood exactly what had happened. One calm signature had accomplished what endless public arguments never could. Marcus returned the pen to his desk. His assistant quietly closed the folder. Neither of them spoke again. There was nothing left to prove. The decision had already spoken louder than outrage ever could, reminding everyone watching that dignity, when joined with responsibility, carries a power no public confrontation can ever equal. Before the announcement appeared online, Marcus approved one final draft. He read every sentence carefully, removed unnecessary words, crossed out every phrase that sounded emotional. When he finished, he handed the page back. This is the one. His communications director reviewed it once more. No accusations? No. No personal comments? None. She smiled faintly. It says more this way. Within minutes, the statement appeared on the company's official website. Ellison Technologies has suspended its partnership with the airline until independent reforms demonstrate measurable improvements in fairness, accountability, and passenger treatment. Nothing more, nothing less news. Organizations published it immediately. Television anchors paused their debates. Industry analysts reread every line. One aviation consultant quietly admitted, "He never attacked them." Another replied, "He didn't need to." Across the country, airline executives requested emergency meetings. One chief executive asked his compliance officer, "Do we have policies like this?" The answer came after an uncomfortable pause. "I honestly don't know." Find out. Inside another airline headquarters, diversity officers reopened forgotten reports. Training manuals returned to conference tables. Managers suddenly questioned procedures nobody had challenged before. Marcus's statement had become more than corporate news. It had become a mirror. Meanwhile, inside the original airline's boardroom, silence returned. The chief financial officer projected revised forecasts onto the screen. The partnership suspension alone will cost millions. Nobody reacted. The chairman stared at Marcus's photograph displayed beside the financial report. "We thought he was just another passenger," the legal director answered quietly. "He was our most important partner." Another executive whispered, "And we never even asked his name." Those words settled heavily across the room. The financial loss was enormous. The damage to credibility was greater. For the first time, every executive understood the truth they had avoided since the boarding. Gate, the man they dismissed, had never been powerless. They had simply been too blinded by assumption to recognize the future standing directly in front of them until it quietly walked away. I'll continue seamlessly from the previous section. Morning. Arrived beneath a sky crowded with satellite dishes instead of clouds. Outside, the airline's headquarters, television vans stretched across the entire block. Reporters adjusted microphones while camera operators searched constantly for movement behind the glass entrance. Every network carried the same question.